I'm Lieutenant Colonel Maggie Anderson, and I earned my rank the long way, years of deployments, leadership, and showing up when it counted. For years, I covered for my parents, sent money home, and kept the peace. But when they mocked my military wedding, that silly outfit, nobody respects you, I drew a line and made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been written off by the very people you cared for? If that's you, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I jump in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being dismissed or humiliated, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I should have seen the signs earlier. At Sunday dinners, when I'd share updates from base, my mother would glance at her watch and redirect the conversation to my cousin's promotion at the bank. When I mentioned receiving commendations, my father would nod absently and launch into stories about his latest golf tournament victories. The uniform hanging in my childhood bedroom closet seemed to shrink a little more each visit home. The pattern was subtle but consistent. During my first deployment, I called every week from overseas. My mother would ask about the weather and whether I was eating enough vegetables, but never about the work itself. My father treated my service like an extended summer camp, something I'd eventually outgrow once I got serious about a real career. They'd introduce me to neighbors as their daughter who was taking some time to find herself in the military. The phrase stung every time. At my brother's engagement party last spring, a family friend asked about my rank and responsibilities. Before I could answer, my father jumped in with his standard deflection. "Maggie's playing soldier for now, but she'll settle down eventually. Real power doesn't come from salutes, it comes from money." The room laughed politely. I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection, wondering when I'd become the family joke. My mother's approach was different, but equally dismissive. She worried constantly about my obsession with discipline and how it would affect my personal life. During one particularly uncomfortable conversation, she suggested I'd never have a real marriage if I kept playing soldier. She meant it as concern, but the words landed like criticism. According to her worldview, my commitment to service was actually selfishness disguised as duty. The holidays that year were especially telling. My parents hosted their usual elaborate Christmas party, complete with catered hors d'oeuvres and carefully curated guest lists. They introduced my brother's fiancée as practically family already and spent 20 minutes explaining her impressive career in marketing. When someone asked about my recent promotion to lieutenant colonel, my mother changed the subject to the new curtains she'd ordered for the living room. I found myself cataloging these moments, collecting evidence of their indifference like pressed flowers in a book. Each slight seemed minor in isolation, but together they formed a clear picture. My achievements were inconvenient truths that disrupted their preferred narrative about who I should be. They wanted a daughter who would validate their choices and values, not one who'd chosen a path they couldn't understand or control. The breaking point came during a family barbecue in July. I just returned from a successful mission overseas and was sharing the details with my uncle, who'd served in Vietnam and actually listened when I talked shop. My father overheard us discussing strategy and tactics and made his opinion clear with a dismissive wave. "All that military talk gives me a headache. Can't we discuss something more pleasant?" My uncle looked embarrassed. I felt that familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck. This wasn't just dismissal anymore, it was active rejection of who I'd become. My father wasn't content to ignore my service, he wanted it erased from family conversations entirely. That night, I sat in my old bedroom staring at the recruiting poster I'd kept since high school. The young woman in dress blues looked confident and proud, everything I'd aspired to become. I realized my parents saw that same poster as evidence of a phase that had lasted too long. They were waiting for me to outgrow my calling the way other people outgrow teenage rebellion. The most painful part was recognizing how long I'd been complicit in my own diminishment. I'd learned to downplay my accomplishments at family gatherings, to change the subject when conversations turned to my work, to apologize for the very thing that defined my adult life. I'd been trying so hard to maintain peace that I'd surrendered pieces of myself at every family function. My mother's criticism of my rigid lifestyle felt particularly unfair. She saw my discipline as inflexibility, my dedication as obsession. The qualities that made me an effective leader, attention to detail, commitment to excellence, willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, were character flaws in her assessment. She wanted me to be softer, more accommodating, more traditionally feminine in ways that would make her more comfortable. Looking back, I can see how their disappointment shaped every interaction. They'd raised me to be strong and independent, but only within limits they could control. My success in the military was the wrong kind of success, too public, too unfamiliar, too far from their suburban comfort zone. They couldn't brag about my achievements to their friends, because those achievements highlighted their own lack of understanding. The signs had been there for years, building like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Their discomfort with my uniform, their inability to discuss my work, their constant suggestions that I consider other career paths, all of it pointed toward the inevitable confrontation that would come with my wedding announcement. I'd been hoping love would overcome their prejudices, that celebrating my happiness would matter more than their disapproval of my choices. But hope is a dangerous thing when it blinds you to patterns that have been consistent for years. My parents had made their position clear through 1,000 small rejections and dismissals. They saw my military service as a prolonged act of rebellion rather than a calling I'd answered with my whole heart. The wedding would simply be the stage where their true feelings would finally be spoken aloud. I should have prepared myself better for what was coming. The signs were all there, written in every awkward silence and redirected conversation. My parents had been building toward this moment for years, and I'd been too hopeful to see it clearly. The storm that was brewing would change everything between us, but at least it would finally clear the air. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd been planning the conversation for weeks, rehearsing different approaches while folding laundry and during morning runs. Michael and I had chosen the date, booked the chapel on base, and started making arrangements. I was ready to share our joy with the people who mattered most. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice bright with the artificial cheer she reserved for phone conversations. I could hear the television playing in the background, one of her evening cooking shows that she watched religiously but never actually cooked from. The familiar sounds of home should have been comforting, but they felt distant already. "Mom, I have wonderful news. Michael proposed, and we're getting married in December." The words tumbled out faster than I'd planned, propelled by nervous energy and genuine excitement. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine her reaction, tears of joy, immediate questions about the dress, offers to help with planning. The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then she cleared her throat, and I heard the subtle shift in her tone that meant disappointment was coming. "Oh, well, that's very sudden, isn't it? You've only been dating for 2 years. 2 years felt like a lifetime when you deployed together, supported each other through the unique stresses of military life, and built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values." But I kept that explanation to myself and pushed forward with the details I'd been excited to share. "We're having the ceremony at the base chapel. It's beautiful, you'll love the stained glass windows. And Michael's family is flying in from Oregon. I know you'll enjoy meeting them." I was painting the picture in broad, appealing strokes, hoping enthusiasm would be contagious. Instead, my mother's voice grew sharper. "The base chapel? Maggie, you can't be serious. What will people think? We have a perfectly lovely church here at home where you were baptized and confirmed. Why would you want some military ceremony when you could have a proper wedding?" The word proper hit me like a slap. Everything about my adult life was apparently improper in her estimation: my career, my home, my partner, and now my wedding plans. I took a deep breath and tried to explain what should have been obvious. "Mom, this is my life. My community. The people I serve with are my family too, and this is where we belong." I kept my voice steady, professional even, though my heart was racing. "Your family is here, Maggie. Your real family. These military people don't know you the way we do. They only see you in that uniform." Her frustration was becoming clearer now, the careful politeness giving way to genuine irritation. Before I could respond, I heard my father's voice in the background, asking what was wrong. My mother must have covered the phone to fill him in, because I caught fragments of their conversation. Military wedding, making a spectacle, What will we tell people? When she returned to the call, both my parents were apparently listening. My father's voice boomed through the speaker with the hearty dismissiveness I'd grown to dread. Maggie, honey, nobody here respects you in that costume. You'll embarrass us all if you show up in that silly outfit. Can you just wear a normal wedding dress like other girls? The words landed like physical blows. Costume. Silly outfit. Nobody respects you. Each phrase stripped away years of achievements, deployments, sacrifices, and service. In their minds, my dress blues, the uniform I'd earned through dedication and worn with pride in dozens of countries, were nothing more than an embarrassing disguise. My mother jumped back in, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she used when trying to convince me to abandon plans she disapproved of. Sweetheart, think about the family photos. Think about how this will look. Your cousin Emma had such a beautiful traditional ceremony last year. Everyone still talks about how elegant it was. Emma. Of course. My cousin who'd married her college boyfriend in a country club ceremony that cost more than my annual salary. Emma, who worked part-time at her father's insurance agency and spent her afternoons at yoga classes and charity luncheons. Emma, who represented everything my parents wished I'd become instead of the woman I actually was. This isn't about Emma, I managed to say, though my voice was starting to shake. This is about Michael and me, and the life we're building together. I thought you'd be happy for us. My father's laugh was sharp and humorless. Happy? We're supposed to be happy that you're making a spectacle of yourself? This whole military phase has gone on long enough, Maggie. It's time to grow up and think about what really matters. Phase. That word again, the one that reduced years of service, training, leadership, and sacrifice to a temporary rebellion that had simply lasted too long. In their narrative, I wasn't a lieutenant colonel who'd earned her rank through competence and dedication. I was a confused child playing dress-up who'd lost track of time. My mother's voice softened slightly, but the message remained unchanged. We love you, sweetheart. We just want what's best for you. And this military stunt isn't it. You could still have a lovely ceremony here at home, with people who've known you since you were little. People who've known me since I was little. People who still saw me as the compliant daughter who'd never challenged their expectations or chosen a path they couldn't control. People who would nod approvingly if I abandoned everything I'd worked for and settled into the comfortable limitations of their suburban worldview. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the damage was already done. Every attempt I made to explain my perspective was met with dismissal or condescension. Every detail about the ceremony I'd lovingly planned was criticized or questioned. By the time I hung up, I felt hollowed out and exhausted. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at the engagement photos Michael and I had taken the week before. We looked happy, confident, ready for whatever came next. The woman in those pictures didn't look like someone wearing a costume or playing at being a soldier. She looked like someone who'd found her calling and the person she wanted to share it with. But my parents couldn't see that woman. They never had, and apparently never would. The memories came flooding back in waves as I sat in the silence after that devastating phone call. I remembered being 8 years old, standing straighter than other kids my age, organizing my room with military precision before I even knew such a thing existed. While my brother collected baseball cards in chaotic piles, I arranged my books by height and kept my desk clear except for current homework assignments. My parents used to brag about my discipline to their friends. Maggie keeps herself organized better than most adults, my mother would say proudly at neighborhood barbecues. My father would ruffle my hair and call me his little soldier, a nickname that felt like praise back then, before it became an insult wrapped in false affection. I was the daughter who never needed reminding to do chores or homework. I set my alarm 30 minutes early every morning throughout middle school and high school, not because I was naturally a morning person, but because I believed preparation was a form of respect for myself, for others, for whatever the day would bring. My parents appreciated the results, but never seemed to understand the philosophy behind them. When other teenagers were pushing boundaries and testing limits, I was volunteering at the local veterans hospital. My Saturday mornings were spent reading to elderly former servicemen, listening to their stories, and learning about sacrifice in ways my sheltered suburban upbringing had never taught me. Those men talked to me like I was someone worth knowing, not just someone's well-behaved daughter. My parents tolerated my volunteer work the same way they tolerated my brother's guitar lessons, as a harmless activity that might look good on college applications. They never asked about the stories I heard or why I kept going back every weekend for 3 years. They never noticed how those conversations shaped my understanding of service, duty, and what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. The scholarship letters started arriving during my senior year of high school. Full rides to prestigious universities, academic honors programs, opportunities that should have made any parent proud. But when the letter from West Point arrived, the family dynamic shifted in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. My mother read the acceptance letter with the same expression she might have worn while reading a medical diagnosis. My father set it aside and immediately started talking about the business degree I could earn at State, how I could graduate with no debt and still have a normal college experience. The military academy wasn't a tremendous honor in their eyes. It was a wrong turn that would take me away from the life they'd envisioned for me. I chose West Point anyway, driven by instincts I couldn't fully articulate but trusted completely. The day I left for basic training, my mother cried like I was going to war instead of school. My father shook my hand formally and told me to remember where I came from. Neither of them seemed to understand that I was trying to become who I'd always been underneath their expectations. The years of service that followed were the happiest of my life, but also the loneliest in terms of family connection. I sent letters and photos from training exercises, deployment zones, and ceremonial events. I called home regularly, trying to bridge the growing gap between my world and theirs. But every conversation felt like a translation exercise. I was constantly trying to make my experiences accessible to people who spoke a different language. During my second deployment, my unit was responsible for humanitarian aid distribution in a region devastated by natural disaster. We worked 18-hour days for weeks, coordinating supply drops, medical assistance, and refugee relocations. The gratitude from local families was overwhelming, and the sense of purpose I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced in civilian life. When I called home to share the experience, my mother listened politely and then asked if I was eating enough protein. My father wanted to know when I'd be back to normal life. Neither of them seemed to grasp that this was my normal life, that I'd found my calling in ways they'd never found theirs. The disconnect became more painful when I started sending money home. My parents had always managed their finances well enough, but unexpected medical bills and home repairs sometimes stretched their budget thin. I wired funds without being asked, the way family members do for each other. But instead of gratitude, I often sensed resentment, as if my ability to help highlighted their inability to refuse help from a daughter whose career they didn't respect. My brother, meanwhile, was building the life my parents had wanted for both of us. Suburban house, office job, weekend golf games with my father, shopping trips with my mother. His achievements were celebrated with family dinners and proud phone calls to relatives. Mine were acknowledged with polite nods and quick changes of subject. The pattern became clear during holiday visits home. My brother's work stories were discussed in detail: office politics, client relationships, promotion possibilities. When I shared updates about leadership positions, overseas assignments, or commendations received, the conversation would inevitably shift to safer topics like weather or neighborhood gossip. I began to realize that my parents' love was conditional in ways I'd never wanted to acknowledge. They loved the daughter who'd been organized, responsible, and academically successful. But they couldn't love the woman who'd taken those qualities and channeled them into a career they found embarrassing or incomprehensible. Looking back now, I can see how their disappointment shaped every interaction for years. They were grieving the life they'd imagined for me while failing to see the life I'd actually built. Their vision of my future involved marriage to someone from their social circle, a career that would impress their friends, grandchildren they could spoil in predictable ways. Instead, they got a daughter who moved frequently, worked in dangerous places, and built relationships with people they'd never meet. They got someone whose service record was more impressive than anything they'd achieved professionally, whose sense of purpose was clearer than their own, whose life had taken on dimensions they couldn't measure or control. The phone call about my wedding wasn't really about ceremony locations or uniform choices. It was the culmination of years of accumulated disappointment, their final attempt to redirect me toward the life they'd always wanted me to live. They couldn't celebrate my engagement because acknowledging my happiness would mean accepting my choices, and they'd spent too many years hoping I'd change my mind. Sitting in that silence after hanging up, I finally understood the depth of the chasm between us. They weren't just disappointed in my wedding plans, they were disappointed in me. The daughter they'd raised had become someone they couldn't recognize or claim with pride. The weeks following that phone call passed in a blur of second-guessing and sleepless nights. I found myself replaying every conversation, every achievement, every moment when I'd felt the subtle sting of their disapproval. The pattern was undeniable once I allowed myself to see it clearly. During my morning runs on base, I'd catch myself imagining different versions of that call. Scenarios where they'd been excited about the engagement, curious about Michael, eager to help with planning. Fantasy conversations where they asked thoughtful questions about the ceremony and expressed genuine interest in meeting my military family. But these alternate realities only highlighted how far we'd drifted from anything resembling mutual understanding. My fellow officers noticed the change in my demeanor during briefings and training exercises. Colonel Martinez pulled me aside after a particularly distracted performance during war games. "Everything all right at home, Anderson?" he asked with the kind of paternal concern that made me realize how much I'd come to rely on my military family for emotional support. I found myself unable to explain the situation without feeling disloyal to my parents, so I offered vague reassurances about wedding stress and family logistics. But Martinez had been in the service long enough to recognize the particular strain that comes from civilian family members who don't understand military life. He nodded knowingly and reminded me that my unit was available for support, no questions asked. That conversation stayed with me for days. The people I served with had become family in ways my biological family never fully would. They understood the weight of responsibility I carried, the sacrifices required by our calling, the pride that came with earning each promotion and commendation. When I walked into the mess hall or attended briefings, I was surrounded by people who saw my uniform as a symbol of competence and dedication, not a costume or silly outfit. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. At base, I was Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, respected for my leadership skills and tactical knowledge. At home, I was Maggie, the daughter who'd gotten sidetracked by a military phase that had lasted too long. The disconnect between these two versions of myself was creating a kind of psychological whiplash that left me exhausted. Michael noticed my increasing withdrawal and gently pressed for details about the family situation. I'd been trying to shield him from the full extent of my parents' disapproval, partly out of embarrassment and partly out of hope that things might still improve. But keeping him in the dark was adding another layer of isolation to an already difficult situation. When I finally told him about the phone call, his reaction was immediate and protective. "They said, what about your uniform?" His voice carried the kind of controlled anger that comes from respecting something that others have dismissed. As a fellow officer, he understood exactly what those words meant and how deeply they would cut. We spent hours talking through the situation, with Michael helping me process emotions I'd been suppressing for years. He'd had similar experiences with extended family members who treated his military service as a temporary job rather than a calling, so he understood the unique pain of having your identity dismissed by people who claim to love you. "The question isn't whether they'll come around," he said during one late-night conversation. "The question is whether you're willing to keep shrinking yourself to fit their expectations." His words were gentle but clear, and they forced me to confront a choice I'd been avoiding. I realized I'd been living in two separate worlds for years, constantly translating between them and exhausting myself in the process. At base, I could be fully myself, confident, accomplished, respected. At home, I played a watered-down version designed to minimize conflict and preserve family peace. The effort required to maintain this dual existence was becoming unsustainable. My sleep became fitful, filled with dreams where I showed up to important ceremonies in civilian clothes or found myself explaining military protocol to skeptical family members who rolled their eyes and checked their watches. I'd wake up feeling anxious and disoriented, as if I'd spent the night defending my right to exist as myself. During one particularly difficult week, I found myself standing in my dress uniform in front of my bedroom mirror, studying my reflection the way I might study a map before a mission. The woman looking back at me had earned every ribbon, every insignia, every mark of distinction visible on that uniform. She'd led soldiers through dangerous situations, made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, and built a career based on competence and integrity. But according to my parents, she was also an embarrassment who needed to change clothes before appearing in public with them. The dissonance between these perspectives was creating a crisis of confidence I'd never experienced before. I began questioning decisions that had felt natural and right for years. Was I being stubborn by insisting on a military ceremony? Was I prioritizing my pride over family harmony? Were my parents right that I was making a spectacle of myself? These doubts felt foreign and uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't fit. I'd never been someone who second-guessed herself professionally, but my parents' disapproval was undermining certainties I'd built my adult life around. The woman who could make tactical decisions under pressure was suddenly paralyzed by wedding planning choices that should have been straightforward. I started avoiding phone calls from home, letting their messages pile up unanswered while I tried to sort through my own feelings. Each voicemail followed a similar pattern, surface-level concern about wedding details followed by subtle suggestions that I reconsider my plans. They never directly apologized for their harsh words during that initial call, but they seemed to sense they'd pushed too hard too fast. The unspoken expectation was that I would eventually come to my senses and plan the wedding they wanted rather than the one that reflected my actual life. They were waiting for me to recognize their wisdom and abandon my stubborn insistence on celebrating my marriage in a context that made them uncomfortable. But the more time I spent in that liminal space between anger and sadness, the clearer my priorities became. This wasn't really about wedding details or ceremony locations. This was about whether I was willing to let other people's discomfort determine how I lived my life, even when those people were family members I loved. The choice was becoming starker every day: continue trying to be the daughter they wanted, or fully embrace being the woman I'd become. The decision crystallized on a cold November morning during a routine briefing about holiday security protocols. As I listened to discussions about base personnel, travel plans, and family visits, I realized I'd been approaching my wedding planning like a negotiation with hostile forces rather than a celebration of love and commitment. I called Michael that evening and told him we were moving forward with our original plans. Full dress uniform, base chapel, military honor guard. No compromises, no attempts to make our ceremony more palatable to family members who'd made their disapproval clear. We were going to celebrate our marriage authentically, surrounded by people who understood and supported our choices. The next phone call home was shorter and more direct than previous conversations. I told my parents the wedding details were finalized and they were welcome to attend if they could be supportive. If not, we'd understand their absence, but wouldn't be changing our plans to accommodate their discomfort. My mother's response was immediate and predictable. "Maggie, you're being selfish. This is about family, not just your personal preferences. Can't you think about how this affects all of us?" Her voice carried the wounded tone she used when she wanted me to feel guilty for setting boundaries. My father's approach was more direct. "Nobody's going to respect this military show you're putting on. You're embarrassing yourself and us. But if you insist on this spectacle, at least tell me you'll change into something appropriate for the reception." Something appropriate. The phrase revealed everything about how they viewed my service and identity. My dress uniform wasn't appropriate for celebrating my own wedding, according to people who'd never worn a uniform or understood what it represented. They wanted me to treat my military identity like a costume I could change out of when real life required more serious attire. "This conversation is over," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Michael and I are getting married on December 15th at the base chapel. I'll be wearing my dress blues because that's who I am. You can attend and be respectful, or you can stay home. Those are your options." The silence that followed was longer and more loaded than any previous pause in our conversations. I could hear my parents exchanging glances over the phone, probably surprised by my directness after years of diplomatic attempts to manage their expectations. My mother tried once more, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "Sweetheart, please don't do this to the family. People will talk. They'll wonder why you can't just have a normal wedding like everyone else." Normal. Another loaded word that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of who I'd become. Nothing about my adult life was normal by their suburban standards, and that had always been the point. I'd chosen a path that required sacrifice, risk, and dedication precisely because normal wasn't enough for me. "Then let them talk," I replied. "The people who matter will understand, and the people who don't understand don't matter." After hanging up, I felt simultaneously drained and energized. Setting that boundary had been terrifying, but also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I'd prioritized my own needs and values over their comfort and approval. The relief was overwhelming. Michael found me sitting on our couch an hour later, staring at the engagement photos we'd propped on the coffee table. He didn't need to ask how the conversation had gone. My expression probably told the whole story. He sat beside me and took my hand without saying anything, offering presence rather than solutions. "They might not come," I said eventually, testing the words to see how they felt when spoken aloud. "I know," he replied. "How do you feel about that?" The question forced me to examine emotions I'd been avoiding. Sadness, definitely. Disappointment that felt like a physical weight in my chest. But underneath those predictable feelings was something unexpected: relief. The prospect of celebrating our wedding without having to manage their disapproval or field their criticism felt like breathing freely after months of holding my breath. "I feel like I should be more upset than I am," I admitted. But honestly, the idea of not having to worry about their reactions during the ceremony is almost comforting. We spent the evening talking through contingency plans and emotional preparations. Michael's family had already embraced me completely, treating my military service as an interesting conversation topic rather than a character flaw. My chosen family, the men and women I served with, were eagerly anticipating the celebration. The guest list would be smaller than originally planned, but it would be composed entirely of people who wanted to be there. The following weeks brought a flurry of wedding preparations that felt joyful rather than stressful. Without the constant need to consider my parents' objections, every decision became straightforward. Colors that complemented our dress uniforms. Music that reflected our shared experiences. Vows that honored both our commitment to each other and our dedication to service. My parents called twice more before the wedding, both times with what seemed like prepared speeches about family unity and the importance of compromise. But their version of compromise always involved me giving up what mattered to me while they gave up nothing. I listened politely and reiterated our plans without engaging in the arguments they seemed to be seeking. The night before the wedding, I pressed my dress uniform with the same care I'd learned as a cadet years earlier. Every ribbon was positioned correctly, every button polished to regulation shine. Looking at myself in the full-length mirror, I saw a woman who'd earned her place in the world through competence and dedication. Tomorrow, I would walk down that aisle as Lieutenant Colonel Maggie Anderson, not as someone's disappointing daughter who'd finally come to her senses. The distinction felt profound and empowering. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother, praying you'll reconsider. "It's not too late to change your mind." I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations had reached their natural conclusion, and this was one of them. I'd made my choice, and tomorrow the consequences would unfold in front of everyone who mattered. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline winter light that makes everything look sharp-edged and purposeful. I woke up at 0500 hours out of habit, then realized I had nowhere urgent to be for several hours. The wedding wasn't until 1400 hours, but my internal clock had been keeping military time for so long that sleeping in felt impossible. Michael had spent the night in the bachelor officers' quarters to honor the tradition of not seeing each other before the ceremony. The apartment felt strangely quiet without his presence, but also peaceful in a way that let me focus on the day ahead without distraction. I made coffee with extra precision, arranged my uniform components in regulation order, and tried to keep my mind centered on what mattered. By 1,000 hours, I was dressed and ready except for the final inspection. My dress blue uniform had been cleaned and pressed to perfection, each ribbon positioned according to regulations I could recite from memory. The jacket fit the way a dress uniform should: crisp, formal, unmistakably military. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt the same pride I'd experienced at every promotion ceremony and formal review. My phone had been silent all morning, which felt both disappointing and predictable. Part of me had hoped my parents would call with a last-minute change of heart, but a larger part was relieved not to have that conversation on today of all days. They'd made their position clear, and I'd made mine. The time for negotiations had passed. At 1,200 hours, my maid of honor arrived to drive me to the chapel. Captain Rebecca Chin had been my roommate at West Point and my closest friend through 2 deployments. She understood military protocol better than any civilian wedding coordinator could, and her presence felt like having family nearby, the kind of family that chose to support each other rather than tear each other down. "You look perfect," she said, inspecting my uniform with the practiced eye of someone who'd conducted countless formal reviews. "Everything regulation, everything in place. Your parents are idiots if they can't see how beautiful you look." The chapel was exactly as I'd imagined it for months. Afternoon sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across wooden pews. The altar was decorated with simple white flowers and military colors that honored both our service branches. Everything looked dignified, appropriate, and completely authentic to who Michael and I had become together. But as I stood in the vestibule waiting for the ceremony to begin, I couldn't help scanning the crowd for familiar faces that weren't there. My parents' absence felt like negative space, a void that pulled attention despite my best efforts to focus on positive elements. The empty pew where they should have been sitting seemed to grow larger as I watched other families settle into their seats. At 1,355 hours, the organist began the prelude music. Michael was already at the altar in his dress uniform, looking calm and confident in a way that made my heart rate slow to something approaching normal. His family filled the first 3 rows on the right side of the chapel, their faces bright with anticipation and joy. My side was well represented too, but differently. Fellow officers, enlisted personnel who'd served under my command, military families who'd become my chosen community over the years of service. They wore a mixture of dress uniforms and formal civilian clothes, but they were all there by choice rather than obligation. The distinction mattered more than I'd expected. At 1,400 hours precisely, the processional began. As I started walking down the aisle, I heard the subtle rustle of movement from the congregation. People were standing, but not in the casual way wedding guests usually do. This was different, more formal, more synchronized. Then I heard Colonel Martinez's voice boom through the chapel with unmistakable authority, "Colonel on deck." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 250 people rose to their feet in perfect unison, their right hands snapping to their foreheads in crisp salutes. The sound of dress shoes hitting the floor echoed through the space like thunder. Every person in military uniform held their salute with regulation precision, while civilian family members stood at attention with hands over their hearts. The sight took my breath away completely. I'd expected a traditional wedding processional, but this was something else entirely, a formal military honor that acknowledged my rank and service in front of everyone who mattered. As I walked down that aisle, I wasn't just a bride in a dress uniform. I was Lieutenant Colonel Maggie Anderson, receiving the respect and recognition I'd earned through years of dedication and sacrifice. Michael's smile was radiant as he watched the ceremony unfold. He understood exactly what was happening and why it mattered. This wasn't show or spectacle, it was authentic recognition from a community that valued what we'd both given to our country. I held my pace steady and my bearing formal as I'd been trained to do during inspections and reviews. But inside, I felt something shifting and settling into place. These people saw my uniform the way I saw it, as a symbol of competence, commitment, and honor. They were saluting not just my rank, but everything I'd done to earn it. As I reached the altar and turned to face the congregation, the salutes held for another moment before Colonel Martinez gave the command, "Order, arms." Hands dropped in unison, and everyone took their seats with the same precision they'd shown while standing. The chapel was quiet except for the sound of rustling fabric and settling bodies, but the silence felt full rather than empty. What had just happened wasn't about military protocol or formal ceremony. It was about family, the family I'd chosen and that had chosen me in return. I turned toward Michael and saw tears in his eyes that matched the ones I was fighting back. We both understood that something profound had just occurred. In front of everyone who mattered, my military family had demonstrated the respect and recognition my biological family had refused to give. The ceremony proceeded with military precision and genuine warmth. Our vows honored both our commitment to each other and our shared dedication to service. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause that felt like celebration rather than obligation. But it was that moment of coordinated saluting that would stay with me forever. In 30 seconds, my chosen family had given me something my parents never could: unconditional recognition of who I'd become and what I'd achieved. They saw my uniform as a symbol of honor rather than embarrassment, my service as a calling rather than a phase. As we walked back down the aisle together, I caught sight of the empty pew where my parents should have been sitting. For a moment, sadness flickered through my joy. They'd missed witnessing something beautiful because they couldn't see past their own prejudices and expectations. But that sadness was brief and quickly overwhelmed by gratitude. I was surrounded by people who celebrated my choices rather than questioned them, who understood my values rather than dismissed them. The family that mattered most had shown up completely, and their presence was worth more than the absence of people who couldn't accept me as I was. Outside the chapel, as we posed for photographs in the winter sunshine, I felt the settled peace of someone who'd finally stopped trying to be two different people. Lieutenant Colonel Maggie Anderson and Maggie the bride were the same woman, and both versions deserved the respect they'd just received. The reception was held in the Officers' Club, decorated with the same understated elegance that had characterized the chapel ceremony. Round tables were draped in white linens with centerpieces of winter flowers and small American flags. The atmosphere was festive but refined, exactly what Michael and I had envisioned for celebrating with our military family. My parents' absence felt more pronounced during the reception than it had during the ceremony. Wedding receptions are designed around family traditions, parents giving speeches, sharing embarrassing childhood stories, dancing with their children to songs that hold special meaning. Without those traditional moments, the celebration took on a different character, but not necessarily a diminished one. Colonel Martinez stepped into the role my father should have filled, offering a toast that acknowledged both my professional achievements and personal happiness. "Lieutenant Colonel Anderson has been one of my most trusted officers," he said, raising his glass to the assembled crowd. "Today we celebrate not just her marriage, but also the leader she's become and the woman she's always been." The words were simple, but carried more weight than any speech my father could have given. Colonel Martinez had worked with me for 3 years, had seen me make difficult decisions under pressure, had trusted me with responsibilities that affected hundreds of lives. His recognition came from direct observation rather than parental obligation. Michael's father filled some of the emotional space left by my family's absence. During the father-daughter dance slot, he approached me with gentle formality and asked if I'd honor him with a dance. "I've gained a daughter today," he said as we moved across the floor to a slow waltz. "And I couldn't be prouder of the woman my son chose to marry." The gesture brought tears I'd been holding back all day. This man had known me for 2 years, but he'd made more effort to understand my choices than my own parents had in a decade. He'd asked thoughtful questions about my deployments, showed genuine interest in my work, and treated my service as something worthy of respect rather than something to be overcome. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. I almost ignored it, but something made me check despite my better judgment. The message was brief: "Saw photos on Facebook. You looked beautiful. Hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to decode the layers of meaning in those few words. It wasn't an apology for missing the wedding or acknowledgement that they'd been wrong about the ceremony. But it was something, a crack in the wall they'd built around their disapproval, a tentative recognition that I'd looked happy and appropriate in my dress uniform. I showed the message to Michael during a quiet moment between dances. He read it twice before responding. "What do you want to do about it?" The question was more complex than it appeared on the surface. My parents had extended what might be considered an olive branch, but it was a very small one that didn't address the fundamental issues between us. They'd acknowledged that I looked beautiful and expressed hope for my happiness, but they hadn't acknowledged that my choices were valid or that their behavior had been hurtful. "I don't know yet," I admitted. Part of me wants to respond, but I'm not sure what I'd say. "Thank you for the bare minimum acknowledgement of my wedding day. Thanks for admitting I didn't embarrass you as much as you expected." Michael squeezed my hand. "You don't have to decide tonight. This is our celebration. Everything else can wait." He was right, as usual. The text message was a development that deserved consideration, but not in the middle of our wedding reception. Tonight was about celebrating with people who'd shown up completely, not analyzing the motivations of people who'd stayed away. As the evening wound down, I found myself talking with Captain Chan about the day's events. We'd stepped outside for fresh air and a brief escape from the music and conversation. The December night was cold enough to make our breath visible, but the sky was clear and full of stars. "How do you feel about everything?" she asked, settling against the brick wall of the officers' club. Rebecca had been my confidant through the entire family drama, so she understood the emotional complexity of celebrating without my parents present. "Surprisingly good," I said, and meant it. I keep expecting to feel sadder about their absence, but mostly I feel relieved. I didn't have to spend the day managing their disapproval or worrying about their reactions. I could just be myself completely. The relief was genuine and more profound than I'd anticipated. Without my parents there to telegraph their discomfort with every detail, I'd been free to enjoy my own wedding without reservation. Their absence had been painful, but their presence would have been distracting in ways that might have overshadowed the joy. "That salute moment was incredible," Rebecca continued. "I've never seen anything like it at a wedding ceremony. You should have seen your face when it happened." I remembered the shock and overwhelming gratitude I'd felt as the entire congregation rose in coordinated salute. It had been spontaneous, but perfectly executed, a demonstration of respect that my parents couldn't have understood even if they'd witnessed it. The moment had validated every choice I'd made about the ceremony and my insistence on wearing my dress uniform. As we headed back inside, I caught sight of myself in the glass doors of the officers' club. My dress uniform still looked crisp and regulation perfect despite hours of dancing and celebration. The woman looking back at me appeared confident, happy, and completely at peace with her choices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions about family relationships. My parents' text message suggested they might be ready for some kind of reconciliation, but on what terms? I wasn't willing to go back to the old patterns of minimizing myself to make them comfortable, but I also wasn't ready to write them off completely. Tonight, though, those questions could wait. I was Lieutenant Colonel Maggie Anderson Hayes now, surrounded by chosen family who celebrated every aspect of who I'd become. The validation I'd received today from people who truly knew me was worth more than years of approval from people who'd never understood me. The last dance was with my new husband, to a song we'd selected together that spoke to partnership, commitment, and building something meaningful together. As we moved across the floor, I felt the settled satisfaction of someone who'd refused to compromise her authentic self, even when the cost was higher than expected. My parents had been wrong about the ceremony, wrong about my uniform, wrong about what would embarrass them. The photos would show a dignified military wedding celebrating two people who'd found each other through shared service and values. Anyone looking at those images would see joy, honor, and appropriate formal celebration. Most importantly, I could see those things too. The weeks following the wedding brought an unexpected shift in family dynamics that I hadn't prepared for. My parents' brief text message had opened a door I'd assumed was permanently closed, but walking through it required navigation skills I hadn't developed yet. 3 days after the ceremony, my mother called while I was unpacking wedding gifts and settling into married life. Her voice was tentative in a way I'd never heard before, as if she was unsure of her reception. "I wanted to thank you for sharing the photos," she said, referring to the formal wedding pictures Michael and I had posted online. "You really did look beautiful." The conversation was awkward and full of careful pauses, but it was also the first time in months that she'd initiated contact without criticism or suggestions for improvement. We talked for 20 minutes about neutral topics: thank you cards, honeymoon plans, how Michael was adjusting to married life. She didn't apologize for missing the wedding, but she also didn't defend their absence. My father's approach was characteristically more direct. He called a week later and got straight to the point. "We made a mistake," he said without preamble. "We should have been there, regardless of our feelings about the ceremony. We let our discomfort override our love for you, and that was wrong." The apology was more than I'd expected, but less than I needed. It acknowledged their absence without addressing their fundamental attitude toward my career and choices. They were sorry for missing my wedding, but were they sorry for the years of dismissive comments and belittling behavior that had led to that absence? I found myself in the strange position of having to decide how much reconciliation I was ready for and on what terms. My parents were extending olive branches, but they were small ones that didn't address the root causes of our conflict. They wanted to repair our relationship without examining why it had broken in the first place. Michael listened patiently as I processed these conversations and tried to determine my own boundaries. His perspective was helpful because he'd witnessed the family dynamics without the emotional history that complicated my own reactions. "They're testing the waters," he observed after I'd described the latest phone call. "They want to see if they can have a relationship with you that doesn't require them to change their fundamental attitudes." That insight was both clarifying and frustrating. My parents wanted me back in their lives, but they wanted the old version, the daughter who would accept their criticism gracefully and modify her behavior to accommodate their comfort. They weren't ready to accept Lieutenant Colonel Anderson Hayes as a permanent identity rather than a phase that might still pass. The challenge was complicated by my own conflicted feelings about reconciliation. Part of me missed the family closeness we'd once shared, even if that closeness had been conditional. Another part of me recognized that going backward would mean surrendering the authentic self I'd worked so hard to claim and defend. During one particularly difficult conversation, my mother made a comment that revealed how little their perspective had actually changed. "Now that you're married and settled down, maybe you'll think about transitioning to civilian life. Michael seems like the type who would appreciate having a wife who was more available." The suggestion was presented as concern for my marriage, but it was really the same old pressure disguised in new packaging. She still saw my military career as something temporary that would naturally be abandoned once I had other priorities. She still didn't understand that my service was integral to my identity, not an accessory I could discard when it became inconvenient. My response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Mom, my career isn't going anywhere. Michael married Lieutenant Colonel Anderson Hayes, not some civilian version of me he's hoping I'll become. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be with who I actually am, not who you wish I were." The silence that followed was long enough to make me wonder if she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. "I just don't understand why you had to choose something so difficult. So far from what we planned for you." There it was, the heart of the matter. My parents were grieving the life they'd imagined for me while struggling to accept the life I'd actually built. They loved me, but they loved their version of me more than the real thing. They wanted me back, but only if I agreed to shrink back into forms they could recognize and control. The conversation ended without resolution, which was becoming a pattern. My parents would reach out with tentative overtures, we'd talk around the edges of real issues, and eventually someone would say something that highlighted how far apart we remained. The distance between us wasn't just geographical or cultural, it was fundamental disagreement about who I was allowed to be. Michael's family, by contrast, had embraced me completely from the beginning. His parents called regularly to check on us both, asked thoughtful questions about my work, and treated my deployment schedule as a normal part of family planning rather than an inconvenience to be managed. The difference in acceptance was stark and sometimes painful. During Thanksgiving dinner with Michael's extended family, His uncle asked about my recent promotion opportunities and listened with genuine interest as I explained the selection process. His aunt wanted to know about base housing options and whether we'd be stationed overseas in the coming year. These weren't polite questions asked out of obligation. They were the kinds of inquiries family members make when they're invested in your actual life, rather than the life they wish you were living. The contrast made me realize how much energy I'd been spending over the years trying to translate my experiences into terms my parents could accept. I'd learned to downplay achievements, minimize challenges, and frame my service in ways that wouldn't threaten their worldview. The effort had been exhausting and ultimately futile. With Michael's family, I could discuss my work directly without filtering or apologizing. When I mentioned missing Christmas due to training exercises, they expressed disappointment but also understanding. When I shared news about commendations or leadership opportunities, they celebrated without qualification. They treated my military identity as interesting and admirable rather than problematic. As the holiday season progressed, I found myself dreading phone calls from my parents while looking forward to conversations with my in-laws. The emotional math was becoming clear. Relationships that required me to hide fundamental aspects of myself were more draining than nourishing, regardless of biological connections. By New Year's Eve, I'd made a decision about how to handle future interactions with my parents. I would remain open to relationship, but only on terms that honored who I'd become. I wouldn't argue or defend myself, but I also wouldn't minimize my achievements or apologize for my choices. They could accept Lieutenant Colonel Anderson Hayes, or they could wait until they were ready to do so, but I was done being someone smaller to make them more comfortable. The decision felt both liberating and sad. Liberating because it freed me from impossible expectations, sad because it might mean continued distance from people I'd once been close to. But the alternative was returning to patterns that had never served anyone well, least of all me. Spring arrived with new orders and fresh possibilities that highlighted just how different my life had become from my parents' suburban expectations. Michael and I were both selected for a joint assignment at a base in Germany, an opportunity that would advance our careers while allowing us to experience military life overseas together. The assignment was exactly the kind of adventure I'd dreamed about as a young officer: challenging work, foreign culture, the chance to build expertise in international operations. Michael was equally excited, and we spent weeks researching the base, the surrounding area, and the professional opportunities available to us. When I called to share the news with my parents, their reaction was predictable but still disappointing. My mother's first response was concern about how far away we'd be and how difficult it would make family visits. My father wondered aloud whether accepting overseas assignments was really necessary for career advancement, or if we were just being overly ambitious. Neither of them expressed excitement about the opportunities the assignment would provide or curiosity about what we'd be doing in our new positions. They saw the posting as an inconvenience that would complicate their lives rather than an achievement that validated our professional competence. "Germany is so far," my mother said, her voice taking on the plaintive tone she used when she wanted me to feel guilty. "And for 3 years? How are we supposed to maintain a relationship when you're halfway around the world?" The question revealed how little she understood about modern communication or military family life. Thousands of military families manage to maintain close relationships across continents and time zones. The tools existed, but they required effort and genuine investment from all parties involved. "The same way we maintain a relationship now," I replied. "Phone calls, video chats, emails. The technology exists to stay connected if both sides want to make the effort." My father's concerns were different but equally frustrating. "This is exactly what I was worried about," he said. "You keep taking assignments that move you further away from real life. How are you going to settle down and start a family if you're constantly moving around the world?" Real life. There it was again, the persistent belief that my military career was somehow separate from or opposed to authentic living. In my father's worldview, real life involved staying close to home, building predictable routines, and prioritizing family obligations over professional opportunities. But my real life was the one I'd built through service, commitment, and willingness to go where I was needed. The assignment to Germany wasn't a deviation from my life path, it was the next logical step on a journey I'd been traveling with purpose and direction for years. "This is my real life, Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my frustration. "Michael and I are building careers that matter to us, and this assignment is an important part of that process. We're not running away from anything. We're running toward opportunities that will make us better officers and better people." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the fundamental disconnect remained unchanged. My parents saw the Germany assignment as evidence that I was prioritizing career over family, while I saw it as evidence that I was building a life worth living with someone who shared my values and ambitions. After hanging up, I sat in our kitchen staring at the acceptance paperwork that would formalize our new assignment. The documents represented excitement, challenge, and professional growth. They were proof that the military trusted us with important work in a strategically significant location. But they also represented another step away from my parents' world and deeper into the community that had become my true family. The geography was symbolic as much as practical. I was choosing a life that would make me happy and fulfilled, even if it made traditional family relationships more complicated. Michael found me there an hour later, still holding the paperwork and processing the emotional complexity of our situation. He'd had similar conversations with extended family members who questioned our decisions, so he understood the unique exhaustion that comes from defending choices that shouldn't require defense. "How did they take it?" he asked, settling beside me and taking my free hand. "About as expected. Mom thinks we're abandoning the family, and Dad thinks we're avoiding real responsibility. Neither of them can see this as the career opportunity it actually is." Michael squeezed my hand. "Their inability to understand doesn't make our decision wrong. We know what we're doing and why we're doing it. That has to be enough." He was right, but that knowledge didn't eliminate the sadness I felt about my parents' persistent refusal to celebrate my achievements. Other military families dealt with similar challenges, but that didn't make the experience less isolating when it was happening to you. Over the following weeks, as we prepared for the international move, I found myself comparing my parents' reaction with the responses from other important people in my life. Colonel Martinez was enthusiastic about the assignment and offered to serve as a reference for future opportunities. Captain Chin was excited about visiting us in Europe during her next leave period. Michael's parents were already researching travel options and asking about nearby airports. The contrast was stark and revealing. The people who truly understood my priorities were thrilled about our new adventure, while the people who wanted me to be different were worried about the implications for their own comfort and convenience. As our departure date approached, I made one final attempt to bridge the gap with my parents. I sent them detailed information about our new base, the work we'd be doing, and the professional development opportunities the assignment would provide. I included photos of the area and suggestions for visiting that would make travel easier and more appealing. Their response was polite but lukewarm. They acknowledged the information without expressing enthusiasm or curiosity. My mother mentioned that international travel made her nervous, and my father wondered whether we'd considered the financial costs of living so far from family support systems. Once again, their concerns centered on their own comfort rather than our happiness or success. They weren't able to celebrate our opportunities because those opportunities didn't align with their vision of how our lives should unfold. The realization was both painful and clarifying. My parents loved me, but they loved their idea of me more than the actual person I'd become. They wanted me to be successful, but only within parameters they could understand and control. They wanted me to be happy, but only in ways that didn't challenge their fundamental assumptions about life and priorities. 3 weeks before our departure for Germany, I stopped trying to convince them that our assignment was positive. Instead, I focused on the people who were genuinely excited for us and supportive of our choices. The energy I'd been spending on managing my parents' disappointment could be better used preparing for the adventure ahead. The decision wasn't about cutting them off or ending our relationship. It was about accepting the limitations of what that relationship could be given their unwillingness to accept who I'd become. I would continue to love them and stay in contact, but I wouldn't continue to seek their approval for choices that were fundamentally sound. Some relationships require you to shrink yourself to fit, while others encourage you to grow into your fullest potential. My parents fell into the first category, while my military family and marriage fell into the second. The choice between them wasn't really a choice at all. Germany represented freedom, professional growth, and the chance to build an even stronger partnership with Michael. It was exactly where Lieutenant Colonel Anderson Hayes belonged, regardless of who understood that truth and who didn't. If you've ever had to choose yourself over family pressure, I see you. Drop your story below. I read every comment. Have you ever been mocked for the work or uniform that defines you? If your parents dismissed your wedding plans, would you change them or hold the line? What's one boundary you wish you'd set sooner? Do you believe respect can be rebuilt after public humiliation? How? If this resonated, tap like, subscribe for more true boundary-setting stories, and share this with someone who needs the reminder, your worth isn't up for a vote.